Kansas. Flat, boring, forgettable? Or so you think. What if I told you this one state had a family of serial killers who buried bodies under their floorboards and vanished without a trace? Never caught to this day. That scientists literally proved Kansas is flatter than a pancake in a real peer-reviewed journal. That this state banned alcohol 33 years before Prohibition, while speakeasies openly ran on every corner. And that two men showed up to the same governor's office on the same day with armed guards and both refused to leave? We found 71 of the most jaw-dropping, absurd, and shockingly real facts about Kansas that your history teacher was absolutely too scared to tell you. And every single one of them is 100% true. So before we get into it, smash that hype button right now and send this video to someone from Kansas, because after they watch this, they will never look at their own state the same way again. 1. Dodge City, Kansas was so violently dangerous, it made every modern American crime city look like a quiet Sunday picnic. Between 1872 and 1878, this small frontier town recorded more murders per capita than any city in recorded American history. Cowboys rolled in after brutal cattle drives, whiskey flowed freely, and arguments ended with bullets instead of apologies. Historians who crunched the numbers were genuinely shocked. The most dangerous neighborhoods in America today would feel like peaceful retirement communities compared to one average Tuesday night in Dodge City. 2. But Kansas and Missouri once mobilized real National Guard soldiers and built actual military fortifications against each other in 1931 over a single highway bridge toll dispute. Missouri put up barriers and Kansas responded with armed troops. Governors exchanged furious telegrams while soldiers stood on opposite sides of a state line, staring each other down over essentially a fight about pocket change. No shots were fired, but both states were completely serious about going to war over one forgotten bridge. 3. Kansas constitutionally banned alcohol in 1880, a full 33 years before federal prohibition even existed, making it the first state in American history to ban booze by actually amending its own constitution. Politicians stood in the State House genuinely proud of themselves, while every single Kansas citizen who wanted a drink simply rode their horse across the nearest state border. Kansas thought it was being revolutionary. It was really just being early to a party that the entire country would eventually regret joining. 4. A Kansas family running a roadside inn in the 1870s murdered at least 11 guests, buried their bodies under the floorboards, and then completely vanished without a trace. The Bloody Benders smiled at travelers, offered hot meals, seated guests in front of a curtain, and then one family member swung a hammer from behind it. When neighbors finally investigated the property, they found a graveyard beneath the kitchen. Authorities searched for decades and never found them. America's first documented serial killer family simply walked away and disappeared forever. 5. Kansas spent millions of dollars in the 1870s and 1880s building an elaborate commercial barge canal system designed to make the state a major inland shipping hub. Engineers surveyed the rivers, politicians celebrated the future, and construction crews worked for years. Then the rivers permanently dried up before a single commercial barge ever completed one full run. Not one successful voyage. Kansas essentially built an entire highway system and then watched the road evaporate completely before anyone could drive on it. 6. Kansas has absolutely zero natural lakes anywhere in the entire state. Every single lake that exists there was artificially created by humans damming rivers at some point in history. Not one naturally formed lake exists across the whole state. When Kansans go fishing, swimming, or boating, they are always doing it in water that would not exist without human engineering. Nature gave Kansas flat land, extreme weather, and tornadoes, but apparently decided that naturally occurring lakes were simply too generous a gift for one state. 7. Helium was first commercially extracted in the United States right in Dexter, Kansas, back in 1903, and Kansas had something genuinely priceless sitting underneath its own soil. Then, state officials negotiated away their rights to it for almost nothing, all walking away from what would eventually become billions of dollars in future value. Kansas essentially held a winning lottery ticket, looked at it carefully, shrugged, and handed it to someone else for a few dollars. Every birthday balloon floating through America is a small reminder of that spectacular decision. 8. In 1874, a grasshopper swarm descended on Kansas so catastrophically dense that it physically stopped moving locomotives by making the railroad tracks too slippery to grip. The swarm darkened the sky for days like a living storm cloud. Grasshoppers ate wooden tool handles, chewed through leather harnesses, and wiped out entire harvests within hours of arriving. Farmers stood in their fields watching years of work disappear in an afternoon. Kansas did not have a pest problem in 1874. Kansas had an airborne catastrophe that moved across the state like a hungry army. 9. In 1893, two separate men simultaneously swore themselves in as the governor of Kansas on the exact same day, and both showed up to the State House with armed guards refusing to leave. One occupied the governor's office. The other set up in a different room. Both men sent letters insisting the other was an illegal imposter. Armed supporters stood in the hallways glaring at each other for days, while Kansas technically had two fully committed governors running one state at the same time. American democracy has never looked more magnificently confused than it did that week in Topeka. 10. Scientists actually sat down with topographic measurement data and formally confirmed that Kansas is literally flatter than a pancake. They measured both using real geographic tools and published their findings in a legitimate peer-reviewed academic journal. The pancake won nothing. Kansas was officially declared the flatter object on Earth by credentialed researchers who apparently needed the world to know this. Somewhere a Kansas farmer read that study, looked at the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction around him, and felt absolutely no surprise whatsoever at the conclusion. 11. A town in Natoma, Kansas passed an ordinance making it completely illegal for a man to practice knife throwing at women wearing striped dresses. This was not a hypothetical concern somebody invented for fun. An actual circus accident injured a real spectator, and local officials decided the only reasonable government response was to write a specific law about it. Somewhere in a Kansas courthouse archive sits a document that represents one of the most oddly specific pieces of legislation any American town has ever seriously produced. 12. William Quantrill led Confederate raiders into Lawrence, Kansas in 1863 and burned the entire town to the ground while killing approximately 150 unarmed civilian men and boys in a single morning. Quantrill had a list. His men went door to door with it. Women and children were ordered to watch while husbands and fathers were dragged out and shot in their own front yards. Historians consider it one of the worst civilian massacres on American soil during the entire Civil War, and Lawrence, Kansas has never quite forgotten that August morning. 13. Kansas sits on some of the most powerful wind corridors in North America, and the state regularly generates so much wind energy from its flat, open plains that it produces more electricity than it can actually consume. Kansas then sells the leftover power to neighboring states. A place famous for tornadoes ripping everything apart figured out how to make those same winds pay the bills instead. Kansas turned its most destructive natural feature into its most profitable export, and neighboring states are essentially paying Kansas for its weather. 14. Wyatt Earp is one of the most mythologized lawmen in the history of the American West, and his most famous job was right in Dodge City, Kansas. He was also technically fired from it, and the exact circumstances remain disputed, but records show Earp departed his Dodge City position under genuinely unflattering conditions. Hollywood turned him into an untouchable legend. History quietly noted that the most romanticized lawman of the frontier was let go from the very job that made him famous in the first place. 15. Kansas legislators in the 1880s became convinced that mulberry trees thrived perfectly in Kansas soil and launched a full government-backed silk industry, complete with factories, workers, and serious financial investment. The mulberry trees failed completely. The silkworms had nothing to eat. The factories closed. The money disappeared. Kansas had looked at its dry, windy plains and genuinely decided it would become a silk-producing powerhouse to rival anything in Asia. The entire program collapsed so thoroughly that most Kansas history books mention it only as a footnote in a chapter about bad ideas. 16. Kansas currently has approximately 6.3 million cattle living inside its borders, compared to roughly 2.9 million human residents, meaning cows genuinely and mathematically outnumber people by more than 2 to 1. There are Kansas counties where a person can drive for an hour and encounter hundreds of cattle grazing peacefully without seeing a single other human being. Kansas politicians technically represent more cows than voters when you count total living residents. Nobody in the state house has ever proposed giving the cattle representation, but the numbers would suggest they probably deserve a seat. 17. Argonia. And Kansas elected Susanna Salter as the first female mayor in American history back in 1887, and the entire situation started as a prank. A group of men nominated her specifically because they believed it would publicly embarrass women who wanted to participate in politics. Local women found out about the nomination, organized immediately, showed up to vote in force, and Susanna Salter won the election comfortably. The men who designed the prank watched a woman walk into the mayor's office because of them. History remembered her name and forgot theirs entirely. 18. Pizza Hut was born in Wichita, Kansas in 1958 inside a building so remarkably tiny it could only fit 25 customers at one time. Two brothers named Dan and Frank Carney borrowed $600 from their mother, rented the small space, and opened what would eventually become one of the most recognized restaurant chains on the entire planet. The original building still exists and has been preserved. Billions of pizzas have been sold worldwide, tracing directly back to one impossibly small Kansas storefront where two brothers and their mother's money started something nobody expected. 19. A church council president in Wichita. Kansas quietly lived a double life for 31 years as the BTK serial killer, murdering 10 people while simultaneously organizing congregation events, volunteering at church, attending city meetings, and holding positions of civic responsibility. Neighbors described him as helpful. Congregation members trusted him completely. He sent taunting letters to police and journalists for decades. A Dennis Rader was finally caught in 2005 because he asked police if a floppy disk could be traced and then used his church computer to send them one anyway. 20. Kansas has an official state soil. It is called Harney Silt Loam, and it has its own dedicated government webpage, an official state designation, and a celebrated place in the Kansas agriculture curriculum taught to school children. Most Americans cannot name their state bird without thinking hard. Kansas looked at the dirt beneath its feet and said, "This specific dirt deserves recognition, a webpage, and a place in our educational system." Somewhere, a Kansas soil scientist attended the ceremony where their life's work was formally declared the most important dirt in the state. 21. Kansas once passed a law requiring store owners to display the actual physical contents of every single canned good on a shelf, right beside the can, so customers could inspect exactly what they were purchasing before buying it. Store owners across Kansas suddenly had to open cans and arrange their contents on little plates next to the product. Shoppers walked through grocery aisles examining tiny piles of beans and corn like museum exhibits. It remains one of the most logistically exhausting consumer protection laws any American state has ever seriously attempted to enforce. 22. During the Bleeding Kansas crisis of the 1850s, Missouri residents crossed the state border in large organized groups, stuffed ballot boxes with thousands of fraudulent votes, and successfully elected a completely illegitimate pro-slavery legislature that had no legal right to exist. Kansas citizens woke up and discovered they had a government nobody actually voted for. The fraud was so blatant and so massive that it triggered a full congressional investigation. Missouri essentially invaded Kansas with pencils instead of weapons, and temporarily won control of an entire neighboring state through organized cheating. 23. Kansas weather is so extreme and so wildly unpredictable that the state has recorded a summer high temperature of 121 degrees Fahrenheit and a winter low of -40 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes in the exact same geographic locations across different seasons. That is a potential temperature swing of over 160 degrees in one place. Kansas residents own both heavy winter survival gear and cooling equipment capable of handling dangerous heat waves, and they need both regularly. Nature apparently looked at Kansas and decided moderation was simply not an option worth considering for that particular piece of land. 24. Doc Holliday is forever associated with gunfights and frontier violence, but before tuberculosis pushed him westward, he operated a completely legitimate dental practice right in Dodge City, Kansas. Patients sat in his chair, opened their mouths, and let one of the most dangerous men in the American West clean their teeth. Doc Holliday spent his Dodge City mornings as a respectable healthcare professional and his evenings gambling and drinking in the same saloons where men regularly got shot. So he was genuinely a dentist before he became a legend, and Kansas gave him his last normal years. 25. In 1856, Kansas investors and idealists pooled their resources and built an octagon-shaped planned community called Octagon City, based on a popular theory that octagonal architectural design somehow prevented the spread of disease among residents. The geometry was supposed to save lives. Settlers arrived with genuine excitement about living in scientifically superior housing. The community collapsed and was completely abandoned within months because nobody had actually figured out how farming, water supply, or basic infrastructure would work inside an octagon. The disease prevention theory was never tested because Octagon City did not survive long enough to get sick. 26. During the Dust Bowl, Kansas farmers kept planting wheat even as their crops literally blew away in the wind because federal agricultural subsidy programs paid them per planted acre regardless of whether an actual harvest ever occurred. The government was essentially paying farmers to plant crops into a windstorm. Farmers understood this perfectly and kept planting anyway because the subsidy check arrived whether the wheat survived or not. Kansas fields turned into dust storms, while federal money kept flowing, and farmers made a completely rational economic decision inside one of the most irrational agricultural disasters in American history. 27. Carrie Nation was a Kansas woman who walked into saloons in the early 1900s and destroyed them with a hatchet while singing hymns, and she turned the entire operation into a thriving personal business. She ran her own newspaper called the Smasher's Mail. She charged admission for people to watch her raids. She went on a paid national lecture circuit. She sold souvenir hatchets to fans. Carrie Nation discovered that destroying property for moral reasons was not just a calling but an extremely profitable career, and she monetized righteous destruction better than almost anyone in American history. 28. Amelia Earhart was born in Atchison, Kansas in 1897 and became the most famous female aviator in human history. Yet her own hometown barely acknowledged her existence for decades after she achieved international fame. So Atchison only began seriously celebrating her after she disappeared over the Pacific Ocean in 1937, and her mysterious vanishing made her a worldwide icon. The town that produced one of the most remarkable Americans of the 20th century essentially ignored her until tragedy made ignoring her impossible. Atchison has been enthusiastically celebrating Amelia Earhart ever since it was far too late to tell her personally. 29. In 1870, a Kansas City marshal arrested an entire visiting traveling circus, including every single animal in the production, for operating without a proper Sunday permit. The circus performers were detained. The elephants were held overnight in a livestock pen. Tigers reportedly spent the evening in a barn beside confused local horses. And the marshal stood firmly on the law while an entire circus sat under arrest in his jurisdiction because someone had scheduled a performance on the wrong day of the week. It remains one of the most logistically complicated arrests any American law enforcement officer has ever attempted to process. 30. Liberal, Kansas, and Olney, England have held a simultaneous international pancake race every single year since 1950, where women in both towns race on the same day flipping pancakes and then compare finishing times across the Atlantic Ocean. Two towns on opposite sides of the world connected by a foot race and a breakfast food have maintained this partnership for over 7 decades without interruption. Liberal, Kansas is a small town in the middle of the American plains that has an ongoing international athletic rivalry with an English village. And both communities take the competition completely and utterly seriously every single year. 31. Multiple Kansas towns had official ordinances prohibiting automobiles from driving on Main Street on Sundays. Laws originally written during the horse and buggy era that technically remained on the books and legally enforceable decades after cars had completely replaced horses as the standard method of transportation everywhere in America. City councils forgot to remove them. Lawyers occasionally discovered them during property disputes. The Kansas residents were theoretically breaking the law every Sunday simply by driving to church in a vehicle that had been commercially available for 30 years before anyone bothered updating the ordinance. 32. John Brown arrived in Kansas in 1856. and one night led a small group of followers to the homes of 5 pro-slavery settlers along Potawatomi Creek, pulled them from their beds while they slept, and killed them with broadswords in front of their families. Brown believed God had personally assigned him the mission. Historians who have studied the sequence of events leading to the Civil War frequently credit that single night in Kansas as the moment armed conflict between North and South became genuinely inevitable. One man with a sword in a Kansas field changed the direction of American history permanently. 33. Now, the exact geographic center of the contiguous United States sits in a Kansas wheat field near the small town of Lebanon, and the spot is marked with a modest stone monument. Beside that monument sits a tiny, non-denominational chapel that seats exactly 7 people at one time. The absolute middle of America is a wheat field in Kansas, with a chapel barely large enough to hold a very small family reunion. Tourists drive hours across empty plains to stand in the precise center of their country and take a photograph beside a stone marker surrounded by wheat. 34. Wild Bill Hickok served as Marshal of Abilene, Kansas, and during his tenure in law enforcement killed more men in official confrontations than almost any other lawman documented in frontier history. So every single killing was ruled legally justified by the authorities of the time. Hickok walked through Abilene as the most dangerous official in a dangerous town, and the law agreed with him every single time he pulled a trigger. He was essentially untouchable legally while being genuinely terrifying personally, and Abilene, Kansas was the place where Wild Bill Hickok became something closer to a force of nature than a public servant. 35. Kansas planned and partially constructed an entire city in 1870 called Agricola, designed as a fully communal farming settlement where all residents would share labor equally and divide harvest collectively among the community. The experiment lasted 18 months before completely collapsing, because residents could not reach any agreement whatsoever about which specific individual was personally responsible for which specific crop rows in the shared fields. Kansas tried communal farming before it was fashionable and discovered the same problem every communal farming experiment discovers, which is that nobody ever agrees on who is supposed to weed the carrots. 36. The catastrophic blizzard of 1886 and 1887 descended on Kansas with such ferocious intensity that it killed an estimated 80% of all open-range cattle across the entire state in a single winter season. Ranchers, who had built entire fortunes on massive cattle herds, walked out after the thaw and found frozen carcasses stretching to every horizon. And hundreds of Kansas cattle operations were completely wiped out financially in one season by one storm. The open-range cattle era in Kansas effectively ended that winter, and the ranching industry that survived looked fundamentally different from anything that had existed before the blizzard arrived. 37. Kansas women were granted the legal right to vote in municipal elections all the way back in 1887, which was a full 33 years before the 19th Amendment, gave women nationwide voting rights in federal elections across all of America. Kansas women were electing mayors and city council members, while women in most other states had absolutely no political voice of any kind. Kansas handed women a ballot in 1887, and then the rest of the country spent the next 3 decades slowly working up the courage to do the same thing Kansas had already decided was perfectly reasonable. 38. The drive-in restaurant concept, where customers park their vehicles and get served food directly at their cars, was pioneered in Wichita, Kansas in 1921 at a place called the Pig Stand, long before California invented the car hop culture that Americans typically associate with the entire idea. Kansas created one of the most distinctly American dining experiences in history, and then California got all the cultural credit for it. Every car hop, every drive-in movie meal, every tray hooked onto a car window traces back to a Wichita, Kansas parking lot in 1921 that almost nobody outside Kansas knows about. 39. A organized gang of Kansas horse thieves operated successfully for 6 straight years during the 1870s, using an elegantly simple system that law enforcement struggled to counter effectively. They stole horses in Kansas, rode them across the Missouri border, changed the brands on the animals, and then sold the rebranded horses back to Kansas buyers who had no idea they were purchasing their neighbor's stolen property. The horses literally went across one state line and came back through another transaction completely unrecognizable. Kansas was essentially funding a horse recycling operation without knowing it was the customer and the victim simultaneously. 40. Carrie Nation's raids on Kansas saloons were so publicly dramatic and so widely covered by newspapers across the country that admission-paying crowds began following her into establishments specifically to watch her swing a hatchet through furniture and bottles. The saloon owners she destroyed occasionally sued her. She paid fines from lecture circuit earnings. Kansas had accidentally created a situation where a woman destroying illegal drinking establishments was simultaneously breaking other laws and generating enough personal revenue to cover all her legal expenses comfortably. Carrie Nation turned moral outrage into a self-funding enterprise that would make modern influencers genuinely envious. 41. So Amelia Earhart's hometown of Atchison, Kansas contains her actual birthhouse, which still stands today, and the Kansas State Historical Society spent decades debating whether it deserved official landmark status, while the rest of the world was busy naming airports, schools, and postage stamps after her. A woman who flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean and attempted to circumnavigate the entire globe grew up in a Kansas town that moved at the speed of a government committee when it came to honoring her. Atchison eventually got there, but the airports named after her opened considerably faster. 42. The Long Branch Saloon in Dodge City, Kansas, is one of the most romanticized and mythologized drinking establishments in the entire history of the American West, and for a significant portion of its operational history, it was primarily owned and managed by a woman named Dora Hand. Every cowboy film, every Western novel, every television show featuring tough men drinking whiskey in Dodge City was set inside a bar that a woman was actually running. Hollywood spent a century making movies about Dodge City and consistently forgot to mention that the most famous saloon in frontier mythology had a female boss. 43. And Kansas launched a full government-sponsored program in the 1880s designed to establish a thriving commercial sugar beet industry as an agricultural alternative to wheat and cattle, with real funding and genuine political enthusiasm behind it. Then, Kansas soil proved completely and utterly incompatible with commercial sugar beet production on any meaningful scale. The beets failed. The processing facilities sat empty. The funding evaporated. Kansas had looked at its agricultural landscape, identified wheat and cattle as its strengths, and then decided what it really needed was to become a sugar beet powerhouse for reasons that made sense to someone in 1880. 44. Cattle trails cutting through Kansas in the 1870s moved so many longhorn cattle northward that eyewitness accounts from the period describe herds stretching from one horizon to the complete opposite horizon with no visible end in any direction. An estimated 5 million cattle were driven through Kansas between 1867 and 1886 alone. Kansas was essentially the world's largest outdoor cattle highway for nearly 2 decades. Ranchers, cowboys, and trail bosses treated the entire state as a corridor, and Kansas towns along the trails built their entire economies around serving men who were just passing through with millions of animals. 45. Kansas held a referendum in 1867 on whether black men should receive the right to vote, 2 full years before the 15th Amendment made that right the law of the entire nation. And Kansas voters rejected it by a wide margin. Kansas was a free state. Kansas had been founded specifically on anti-slavery principles. Kansas sent soldiers to fight for the Union. Then Kansas voters looked at a ballot asking whether black men deserved voting rights and said no anyway. The contradiction between what Kansas stood for and what Kansas voters actually decided that day has never been fully explained away. 46. Farmers near Brenham, Kansas, spent generations plowing around unusual iron-laced rocky patches in their fields, assuming the strange metallic soil was simply a quirky geological feature of that particular stretch of Kansas land. Those patches were actually fragments from one of the largest palisite meteorite impacts ever discovered in the contiguous United States. Ice space had literally crashed into Kansas, and farmers drove their plows around the evidence for decades, without realizing they were farming next to one of the most scientifically significant impact sites in American geological history. The universe left Kansas a gift, and Kansas plowed around it. 47. The Dalton Gang rode into Coffeyville, Kansas on October 5, 1892 with a plan so audacious it had never been attempted anywhere in American criminal history. They intended to rob 2 separate banks simultaneously on the same street at the same time. Coffeyville residents recognized them immediately despite their disguises, retrieved weapons from a hardware store, and positioned themselves around the street. The entire gang rode in as legends and was nearly wiped out within minutes by armed townspeople who had been waiting calmly. See, 4 gang members died. Coffeyville, Kansas, defeated one of the most notorious outlaw gangs in history before lunch. 48. Kansas ghost towns outnumber its currently functioning incorporated towns by a significant margin, with hundreds of completely abandoned settlements scattered across the state, many of which still have standing structures, old cemeteries, crumbling storefronts, and clearly visible street grids that nobody has driven on in decades. Towns that once had post offices, newspapers, schools, and ambitions simply emptied out as farms consolidated, railroads rerouted, and populations drifted towards cities. Kansas contains entire communities frozen in various states of abandonment, like a museum of American optimism where somebody built a whole town, filled it with hope, and then everyone quietly left. 49. A Kansas statute from 1868 made the crime of baratry, which means encouraging unnecessary and frivolous lawsuits, a punishable offense under state law, and that specific statute remained technically present on the books for over a century long after the legal concept it described had completely ceased to exist in any meaningful form of modern legal practice. Kansas lawyers occasionally stumbled across it during legal research. Nobody was ever charged under it in the modern era. Kansas had a law against encouraging too many lawsuits sitting quietly in its legal code, while Kansas courts processed thousands of cases every single year directly beneath it. 50. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery militias operating across Kansas during the violent 1850s Bleeding Kansas period were so poorly organized, so inadequately led, and so chaotically structured that multiple documented historical incidents show competing factions accidentally ambushing and getting into genuine armed skirmishes against their own allied groups. During the same week, they were supposed to be fighting each other's enemies. Men rode out to fight for their cause and occasionally shot at people who completely agreed with them. Kansas in the 1850s was less a territory on the edge of civil war and more a demonstration of what happens when everyone is angry and nobody has a map. 51. Every single river flowing through Kansas is technically too shallow for commercial navigation, despite the state having more total river mileage than most other landlocked states in America. Not one Kansas waterway has ever supported sustained commercial river traffic of any meaningful kind throughout the entire recorded history of the state. Kansas has rivers everywhere and cannot use a single one of them to move goods. Nature gave Kansas an elaborate network of ribbons of water, and then made every single one of them just shallow enough to be completely commercially useless to everyone. 52. Bat Masterson served as sheriff of Ford County, Kansas, and built a reputation as one of the most capable lawmen of the entire frontier era, before eventually leaving law enforcement behind completely. He then moved to New York City and became a celebrated sports writer for a major newspaper. Bat Masterson spent his final years writing sports columns, arguing about boxing matches, and building a second career as a respected journalist. He died in 1921 sitting at his desk in the middle of writing a column. Kansas produced a frontier lawman who ultimately turned out to be more influential holding a pen than a gun. 53. An 1878 Kansas railroad land fraud scheme sold hundreds of thousands of acres of completely non-existent prime farmland to European immigrants who packed their belongings, crossed an ocean, and traveled to Kansas full of genuine excitement about starting new lives on fertile, productive land. They arrived to find treeless, waterless plains. The promotional brochures had described lush green paradise. The actual Kansas landscape they encountered was flat, dry, and unforgiving in every direction. Immigrants who had given up everything stood on empty plains holding brochures, promising something that had never existed anywhere near where they were standing. 54. Kansas chickens quietly produce over 1.2 billion eggs annually, making Kansas a consistent top 10 egg producing state in America, yet virtually no American outside Kansas has ever mentally associated Kansas with eggs in any context whatsoever. People think of Kansas and picture wheat, tornadoes, and Dorothy. Nobody pictures eggs. Kansas has been producing a significant portion of America's breakfast for decades in complete anonymity, while other states get credit for agricultural products they produce in far smaller quantities. Kansas feeds America's mornings, and America has absolutely no idea Kansas is involved. 55. The Kansas Populist Party of the 1890s achieved something that no third party in American political history has ever replicated before or since by simultaneously controlling the governorship, both United States Senate seats, and the entire state legislature at exactly the same time. A third party achieved complete governmental dominance over an entire American state. Political scientists still study it. It happened because Kansas farmers were furious about railroad prices and decided to build their own political movement from scratch rather than complain to parties that were not listening. Kansas accidentally demonstrated that American third parties could actually win everything if people got angry enough. 56. Fort Leavenworth was established in Kansas in 1827, making it the oldest continuously active United States Army post anywhere west of Washington, D.C., and it has been an uninterrupted military operation ever since, meaning Fort Leavenworth was already a functioning military installation for over 30 years, before Kansas even officially became a state in 1861. The fort predates the state it sits inside. Kansas became a state, and Fort Leavenworth had already been there long enough that the soldiers stationed there could have told the new state government several interesting stories about what the land looked like before anyone voted on anything. 57. Kansas frontier justice in the 1870s was so improvised, so underfunded, and so casually organized that multiple towns across the state formally designated their local barber as the acting town coroner simultaneously. The same individual who trimmed beards and cut hair for paying customers in the morning was the legally recognized official responsible for examining dead bodies and declaring cause of death by afternoon. Kansas had essentially decided that a person comfortable with sharp instruments and close human contact was qualified for both professions. The barber coroners of Kansas handled two of the most personal services a community could require from one chair. 58. The Kansas State Fair in Hutchinson has featured a butter sculpture competition continuously since 1913, where artists carve life-sized figures and elaborate scenes entirely from hundreds of pounds of real butter displayed in a refrigerated glass case for the entire duration of the fair. Visitors line up to watch dairy products become art. Sculptors spend weeks planning creations that will be admired for 10 days and then melted. Kansas developed an annual tradition of creating genuinely impressive artwork from a sandwich ingredient, and generations of Kansans have stood in front of a refrigerated case treating butter with the reverence normally reserved for marble. 59. Kansas sits directly above the Ogallala Aquifer, which is one of the largest underground freshwater reserves anywhere on the entire planet, containing enough water to fundamentally transform Kansas agriculture, and yet surface-level drought crises regularly devastate Kansas farms, while billions of gallons of fresh water sit silently underneath the topsoil waiting. Kansas has a water crisis happening above ground, while an enormous ocean of fresh water exists below ground. The state is essentially a person dying of thirst while sitting on top of a buried swimming pool and arguing about whether it is worth the effort to dig down and find it. 60. Kansas remained completely and legally dry for 68 continuous years, stretching from 1880 all the way to 1948, while illegal speakeasies, professional bootleggers, and underground bars operated openly and enthusiastically in nearly every Kansas city with minimal serious interference from law enforcement during the entire period. Kansas had banned alcohol constitutionally, and then watched the ban get ignored comprehensively for 7 decades by the same citizens who lived under it. The law existed on paper with complete confidence, while the reality on every Kansas main street was something considerably more relaxed and considerably more profitable for anyone selling illegal whiskey. 61. Bleeding Kansas pro-slavery militias rode into the anti-slavery settlement of Lawrence in 1856 and destroyed printing presses, burned buildings, and ransacked homes, while newspaper editors across America watched the telegraph reports come in and collectively declared that what just happened in Kansas was the opening act of an American Civil War. Politicians in Washington read the dispatches and went pale. Lawrence, Kansas was a small settlement of idealistic settlers who wanted to farm peacefully, and instead became the location where the entire nation realized a conversation about slavery had permanently turned into something far more violent and irreversible. 62. Kansas sits directly above the Ogallala Aquifer, and also receives water from the Arkansas River system. Yet the state filed a formal lawsuit against Colorado for unlawfully diverting Arkansas River water upstream before it could reach Kansas. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Kansas won. The legal battle became one of the longest-running interstate water disputes in American judicial history and established landmark precedents for how American states negotiate water rights with each other. Kansas fought a water war entirely through lawyers and courtrooms, and won water that Colorado had been quietly redirecting for years. 63. The Flint Hills region of Kansas contains the largest remaining intact tallgrass prairie ecosystem anywhere in North America, covering over 4 million acres of grassland that once spread across 170 million acres of the entire continent before European settlement transformed the landscape permanently. Kansas is sitting on the last significant piece of an ecosystem that used to define the heart of an entire continent. It eat of the tallgrass prairie that once stretched endlessly across America now exists in meaningful quantities, almost exclusively in one Kansas region that somehow escaped the plow long enough to still be standing while everything around it disappeared. 64. Belle Starr was known across the American West as the Bandit Queen, and during one stretch of her outlaw career, she hid successfully in Kansas for multiple years by passing herself off convincingly as a traveling evangelist moving between rural communities. She preached. She attended church socials. She signed at least one church membership registry under a false name. Local communities welcomed her warmly as a woman of God while she was actively wanted by law enforcement across multiple states. Belle Starr hid from the law inside Kansas churches, and the congregations who sheltered her had absolutely no idea who was sitting in their pews. 65. Kansas began constructing its state house in Topeka in 1866 and ran completely out of money mid-construction, leaving the dome unfinished and open to weather for nearly 30 years, while the state legislature continued meeting inside the incomplete building directly underneath the gaping, unfinished structure above their heads. Politicians debated Kansas law, passed budgets, and conducted official state business while sitting beneath a dome that had no top on it. The state house that was supposed to represent Kansas' dignity and permanence spent 3 decades looking like a construction site while the government inside it tried to project an image of competence and authority. 66. Kansas produces enough wheat in a single average harvest year to theoretically feed every person currently living on Earth for approximately 2 weeks. Yet the state imports the majority of commercial bread products sold in its own grocery stores from outside producers. Kansas grows the wheat that feeds the world and then buys its own bread from somewhere else. Farmers harvest record-breaking quantities of grain that leaves the state immediately, while Kansas supermarkets stock their shelves with bread baked in facilities that Kansas wheat probably supplied from 3 supply chain transactions away. Kansas feeds everyone except apparently itself. 67. A Kansas gubernatorial election in the late 1800s became so bitterly disputed that the candidate who believed he had won hired a professional locksmith. He broke into the actual governor's office in the State House, physically occupied the room, and then refused to vacate the premises for any reason while his supporters stood guard outside the door. The sitting governor was on the other side of that door. Kansas had an election, produced 2 men who both believed they won, and resolved the dispute the way reasonable governments sometimes do, which is by picking a lock and daring someone to remove them. 68. The first Walmart-style discount retail concept was quietly market-tested in a Kansas community in the early 1950s by retail experimenters trying to determine whether Americans would shop in large, low-priced general merchandise stores if given the opportunity. The Kansas experiment failed commercially before the concept could be refined. Sam Walton studied what went wrong. I adjusted the model and built Walmart into the largest retail corporation in human history. Kansas essentially ran the beta test for the store that would eventually employ more Americans than any private company in existence and received absolutely no credit for the trial run. 69. A Kansas County sheriff operating in the 1870s created wanted posters so spectacularly inaccurate in their physical descriptions of actual fugitives that he arrested and briefly jailed more than a dozen completely innocent men before ever successfully apprehending a single genuine criminal he was actually looking for. The descriptions were vague, The illustrations were worse, and the sheriff was persistent in entirely the wrong direction. So Kansas frontier justice was already improvised, but this particular sheriff managed to transform the wanted poster system into something that was statistically more dangerous for innocent people than for the outlaws it was designed to catch. 70. The official state song of Kansas is Home on the Range, which was written in 1872 by a Kansas doctor named Brewster Haley on his homestead claim and then stolen, plagiarized, published without credit, and disputed in multiple separate lawsuits stretching across more than 60 years before Kansas officially and formally claimed it as the state song. A doctor wrote a song about loving Kansas, someone took it, and Kansas spent 6 decades in legal arguments trying to get credit for its own anthem. A Home on the Range is a song about peaceful open skies that spent most of its existence trapped in a courtroom. 71. Fewer than 15% of Kansas homes have storm shelters or basements, despite Kansas being struck by more significant tornadoes than any other state in all of recorded American meteorological history, making it simultaneously the most tornado-exposed and the most tornado-under-sheltered populated region in the entire country. Kansas residents watch tornado warnings on television, look out their windows at rotating clouds, and then stand in interior hallways because the basement that should exist beneath their feet was never built. The most tornado-battered state in America looked at the problem of having nowhere to hide and largely decided not to solve it. And that was 71 of the dumbest, wildest, and most unbelievable things about Kansas that most Americans have never heard in their entire lives. Now here is the real question. Is your state even crazier than Kansas? Because we are about to find out. Drop your state in the comments right now and we will roast it next. If Kansas surprised you, hit that like button, subscribe to Dumbest Things, and stay ready because no state is safe from us.